Hello, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and warm welcome to everybody who's chosen to be at this webinar on 10 ways to engender city transport and planning. My name is Vinita Shetty, and I'm the founder of the Smart Citizen and organizer of Placemaking Week India. I grew up in a city in the 60s, which had the second largest number of bicycle riders in India, and a visible percentage of them were women, some in saris. And women can still be spotted riding confidently on motorized two-wheelers. But it's a different story completely when it comes to four-wheelers, which, as we're about to discover in this webinar, are designed for the male physiognomy and disadvantaged women. As a recent migrant to Barcelona, Spain, I can't help observing that there are fewer immigrant women on bicycles and paddle boards as well. They're almost invisible, enjoying the mainstream recreation offerings of the city. So these are just two examples of mass-centered planning of cities, which leave women out, but they're less obvious ways. And the cost of ignoring or sidelining women's needs and comforts in urban design and planning is enormous. So how do we go about designing a city where the needs of all genders are taken into consideration? I can't think of a more articulate and authoritative opinion maker on the subject than Nidhi Gulati. She's a social impact executive, a trained architect, and an urban researcher with a specialization in civic engagement. Since 2012, she's worked on transportation, advocacy, placemaking, technical assistance, and education projects spread across 12 American states and 7 countries. She strongly believes that the built environment has a substantial and sustained impact on the personal and social lives of people that inhabit them. And she is pledged to dedicate her career to advancing design and planning practices that cultivate physical, social, and financial well-being for all, especially children in marginalized communities. Her current roles include a senior director position at Project for Public Spaces, a global urban planning and design nonprofit organization based in New York City. She's also visiting faculty at Pratt Institute, a guest writer for several online publications on shaping cities with a focus on early childhood. Now, Placemaking India is a self-organized collective of architects, urban planners, urban designers and researchers, social workers, activists, and government administrators. And we are affiliated with Placemaking X, which actually grew out of Project for Public Spaces. And today's session is the third in a series called Urban Jam that Placemaking India has been running during the monsoon, where we engage professionals in the diaspora to share knowledge and expertise with professionals in India. The web call will be moderated by A.V. Venugopal, a founding member of Placemaking India. Venu is a senior research associate for urban development at the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP, India program. And he's been working with various stakeholders in Chennai, providing assistance to complete street and parking management projects through his role at ITDP. He is currently working on expanding the street transformation works across the city through the Mega Streets project. And apart from the various capacity development initiatives that he has been part of with ITDP at the national level, he's also involved in policy planning works for transforming urban mobility to nurture early childhood development in Pune. So let's start with a small film from the World Development Bank that sets the scene. And then I'll ask Venu to continue the conversation. So hang on one second.
Vinita, would you like me to share the screen, or is it?
Is it sharing now? Okay, share. Okay.
Perfect.
And then
Yes.
I go.
Today's cities were designed by men and for men. They reflect traditional gender roles and division of labor. Women occupy about 10% of the highest ranking jobs in the world's leading architecture and planning firms. And when cities are not designed, also the way they're structured tends to mean that there are less amenities, access to services for women. As a result, cities end up in this way working better for men than they do for women.
The built environment reflects and reinforces gender inequalities. Key aspects of our urban environment related to access, mobility, safety, health, hygiene, and climate resilience create a disproportionate burden for women and girls. Women, girls, sexual and gender minorities face challenges ranging from buses that fail to accommodate strollers to sidewalks that don't fit families, and the general lack of lighting and toilets in public spaces. Well, this has enormous impacts on women's access to jobs, to schools, and on their freedom and safety, as well as their health and agency.
So the objective of the handbook is to reduce the inequalities that women and gender minorities face every day in the built environment. The handbook is a very concrete tool. It is designed and thought for practitioners and planning professionals. And it is focused on two elements, on the process and on the output. On the process, in the sense that it provides step-by-step indications and advice on how to include views and needs of this group. And in the output, in the sense that it tries to coordinate that to make sure that those views and needs are incorporated into the project. In the end, what we want is a city that is designed for everybody, a city that incorporates the views and the needs of all these groups, and where they can really reach the full benefits of urbanization.
Okay, over to you, Venu.
Thank you so much, Vinita. Hello, everyone. All of you have tuned into the session as well. A very nice introduction, Vinita, and I think the video itself has set the tone for the topic and the conversation that we'll be having. So I'd like to just add one particular insight that a project that we had done in Chennai recently for a street transformation work in Pedestrian Plaza, where it was an example where it was very participatory and inclusive in its process. And the success when it's a project, a public space that is designed looking at the different stakeholders, the success is seen when you talk to the people at the end of the project. For instance, we had done a quick impact assessment in this particular street after the project, and we were very happy and reinforcing to see how over 95% of the women who responded said that they felt more safe in the space. They could spend more hours after sunset in the space. So the kind of change the process of design and the design itself and the people who are involved in the design can bring in the quality of a street in the public space can be seen in many great examples that are there across the world as well. And without any further ado, over to you, Nidhi, for taking us through your thoughts and the 10 ways to engender city and transport planning in India.
Thank you, Vinita, and thank you, Venu, for setting this up. I'm going to do a quick presentation just to list out 10 ways if people wanted to do screen grabs and whatnot. And then I would love to come back and have more of a casual conversation. My screen sharing is actually disabled, Vinita. I think you might have to make me a co-host for me to share screen. In the meantime, I can get started on just an introduction of who I am and where I come from. My name is Nidhi Gulati. I'm a Senior Director at Project for Public Spaces. I am a born and raised Indian, and about 10 years ago, I moved to the United States to pursue my second degree from architecture going into landscape architecture. And what happened in my life was that I was an architect working in Delhi as a self-sufficient as you can be in a patriarchal city, fairly independent, again, as one can be within the constraints of the patriarchal society. I was living and working there without owning a car and still being able to get almost anywhere And I moved from Delhi to a suburban car-centric town in Texas in the United States. And I still remember to this day coming out of the airport, from like the arrival lounge to where I was going to catch a bus, to a shuttle bus to College Station, Texas. Everybody had disappeared. There were no people in the corridor where I was going to catch a shuttle. At that time, 10 years ago, you know, I didn't have a mobile phone that would work. Wi-Fi was not everywhere. There wasn't free Wi-Fi. I actually went backwards inside the airport to check if I was going in the right direction. And I was told that in fact I was. I followed my gut, went back to take the shuttle. There were 2 or 3 people in the shuttle at max. And between taking the shuttle and arriving in College Station, I probably saw 4 or 5 people actually in space. Everybody else was in a car. And I started questioning immediately, like, what did I just do? You know, did I just get trapped because I forgot to research public transportation and women's access and transportation choice? And from that experience, I think everything else, shaping my education to finding a job at Project for Public Spaces, was really about questioning how our built environment is the way it is, who does it serve best, and what are some of the social, psychological, and environmental aspects or burdens of designing the way some cities have designed. So with that, let's see if I can share my screen now, and I can. Okay, can everybody see it?
Yes, maybe you can make it the full screen as well.
Absolutely. Okay, there we go. So very quickly, as I said, I'm a trained architect, urban researcher, and social impact executive. I'm a senior director at Project for Public Spaces. If anybody was curious, that's my Twitter handle. So what is a gender-equal city in my mind? A city where people of all gender identities don't just coexist, but actually thrive. You know, so we're moving beyond people coexisting in the same city, and we're really talking about a place where people thrive. So what does that look like? You know, when we're happy, when we're accommodated, when we're joyful, it shows. And it can show just in terms of how we occupy space and in terms of how we demonstrate joy on our face. But we obviously can't create something that we can't acknowledge. So as you know, the video from the World Bank just showed, most people who are shaping our cities have been men. Like, the people who are in the audience right now, think back to your own education, either in architecture, urban policy, urban design, urban planning, transportation planning, yet you name it. And think about all the books that you read, and think about who wrote those books. Then who were those people to tell you that those were the best practices? How can Le Corbusier tell me what a good building design is for me, whereas them and me have nothing in common in terms of our culture? In fact, our culture predates many, many, many cultures around the world and has some of the most solid foundations of what good design looks like and what kind of spaces we thrive in. So the kinds of books that we read have been predominantly written by white men. The kinds of building standards that we follow, again, written by men. So if we can't see ourselves in what we're studying, then we can't really create a city that actually represents those unique aspects and nuances of being a female identifier. So even though there have been recent gains in female representation in fields like architecture and city government, there's still a fact today that our cities are still being designed and shaped by men, because we're still following those manuals, we're still following those books. And even though the readers might be women, what we are kind of considering as best practice is being created by, you know, generations of a systemic sexism and racism in our field. So even, you know, I'm based in New York City, and just thinking about New York City alone for a second, women make majority of the population in the city of New York and in the country of United States. More than 50% are female. Yet our representatives, people whose job it is to govern on our behalf and govern for us, only 12 out of 51 New York City councilors are women. And then if we look at who's more vulnerable, who needs more representation and who needs more governance, we again think about poverty, age, and gender. Women are much more susceptible to living under poverty and to having to live with all the other aspects of you know, living under poverty that come with it. So, you know, the largest demographic that is living under poverty are women, 25 to 34 years of age, followed by women, 35 to 44, and then followed by women again between the ages of 18 to 24. So the people who need voice representation and their unique needs cater to are women in the city, and yet the people who are creating these policies and mechanisms for governing the population are not women. But if we stop, you know, looking at where the power lies for a second and just in our day-to-day lives, our little girls, the you know, women at a young age, we are everywhere, and we just have to be allowed to take up the space that is rightfully ours. So what are some of the ways in which we can start to think about gender mainstreaming in the profession of urban planning and design? And some of these tips would actually look like they could apply to anything, but then to know that urban planning and city is probably the most complex system that exists in our lives. So something that applies to any other system also applies to city planning. So first and foremost, the important thing for us to do is to acknowledge that there's a gap. Acknowledge to ourselves and for our male peers to acknowledge that there's a gap in representation of people who identify as women and other gender identities. They haven't been represented in the policies, the manuals, and the literature that we kind of study to get trained in these fields. So understanding that there's a problem and there's a gap is step number one. Step number two is to actually read into that gap. Like, let's not just rely on our gut, let's fact check. Let's think about some of the sort of, you know, early best practices of what was considered good design. Who has traditionally held power in creating our cities? We would also find that in the early ages of like transportation planning, car-centered transportation planning in the United States, people who really had a loud voice were not even transportation planner. Like people like Robert Moses, whose name people might hear a lot as the, you know, the highway guru in the United States, he never even drove himself. So like think about, again, how our city came to be the way it is, and really do our homework, because there's no shortage of data now that's available on gender bias in the creation of systems in our cities. And this gender bias actually exists in all the systems that make up our city, whether that is health system, housing, transportation, food access, open space, education and childcare. In all of these systems, some of them impact women much more deeply and young families much more deeply, and yet we can find less representation and more bias in all of them. And then really understand, where does power come from and how does power flow? Power comes from representation. Power comes from having a seat at the table, and then not just a seat, having your voice heard and your voice validated. So really understand, where does power come from? The people who are shaping our cities are not always urban planners and transportation engineers. They are also our mayors. They are also people who hold public office in different levels, people who hold justice offices, in any position that is in a place of governance and in a place of power. All of those systems have an impact on our city. So once we learn those power systems, our next step is to actually disrupt those systems and start to share power. So people who are currently in the office should think about sharing of power. And everyday citizens and everyday people like you and me should really think about, how does that power get shared today, and how does that power get shared in the future? And even the people who the power is being given to, the women, have to really constantly think about our own biases, because again, we are a product oftentimes of the same system that we're trapped in. I read the same books that were written by male architects, so I have to on a daily basis check myself, even if there's sharing of power. And then changing our leadership. Now let's actually get to representation. Who gets to lead us? Who gets to govern us? Is there representation in our leaders, so that the voices and the unique aspects of what makes our life livable can be embedded at the really high level? And then let's think about people, once policies are created, once, you know, our public officials create policies and mandates, then there's a second level of people who hold incredible amount of power. This is where our planners, architects, and everybody else sits, who are actually interpreting that policy, interpreting the manual, and putting concrete things, buildings, roads, and other things in place. So now we need to think about sharing of power in our interpreters, the middle layer of power holders, and we need more women in those professions that are interpreting the policy that's been written for women so that it's done right. And then when we get to the human scale, at the project scale, really consult with women. There's a need to actually talk to women and other gender identities. What makes a city livable for you? What is it that you need? And how can we really prioritize your well-being and your access to the city in every aspect? So consult with them instead of trying to guess what it is that women might need. It's really quite simple to actually just bring women's voices to the table. And when it's time to actually build things, when it's time to get things together, hire women. We should work with women and empower them through the process, build ownership, stewardship, and then continue that sharing of power at every stage of creation of our cities. So, there are lots of groups that are now available that talk about, women in the industries of building and the other things. And then this is really for us female identifiers. Embrace your opinion. If at any point it feels to you like, I'm feeling uncomfortable in this space and I don't think where I am is the right place for me, don't discount that feeling and don't let somebody mansplain to you that your feeling is not the right feeling. Embrace your opinion, understand how you are experiencing the world through a very different vessel that is your body, which is different from a male body. Understand that you're feeling something different and trust yourself. So really, really embrace your opinion and don't let others discredit that opinion. And then when power is given, slowly grow into that power. Use everyday life to grow into that power. And never doubt that if you're a small group, if it's 8, 9, 10, or 12 of us here today, never doubt that that small and thoughtful group can actually change the world, because change in the world has always been made that way by a small group of really passionate, committed people. I will stop there, Venu, and we can bring other slides as we get to some of the Q&As.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nidhi. That was very crisp and, quick 10 points through your experience over the years. So very insightful. Thank you so much. Just trying to draw parallels to the conversation on equal cities and where India stands in the spectrum. How far do you think Indian cities are from being gender equal, if you were to say so?
I think we're very far, and it's not just Indian cities. I actually want to say that it's everywhere. That was precisely why I wanted to bring the example of New York here, that sometimes when we're sitting far away from each other, we tend to idolize something that may not be true. So I think most cities to this day are still far from being gender equal. Some cities are further along than others because there's a lot of variability within each city. Where I am from, because I can personally, I can speak to only my own experiences. The place where I come from, where I grew up, I did not see women in positions of power. I did not see women in decision-making positions. I did not see women in our political leaders at that time. And I fell into that trap of, oh, what is a woman's place? And then who gets to decide what's a woman's place? So where I grew up in a small town in Haryana, I didn't see women represented anyway. And I personally did not feel comfortable spending time in public spaces. And I kind of, again, fell into the trap of, oh, maybe public space is something you enjoy as a family. Maybe you need to go with dad everywhere you need to go. And those are the kinds of questions that I started asking myself later on. But as I see now, as I just demonstrated, New York City is not that much different, because again, 12 out of 51 city councilors, we've still got a long ways to go. And you can look at architecture curriculums, urban planning curriculums, and you'll find the same thing to this day, that we need to sort of there's a long runway ahead to decolonize our cities and the way that we create them and make them gender equal.
So you spoke a couple of your points on leadership and the need to have women representation and good leaders. Mm-hmm. So recently we had the Paris mayor who was re-elected, and she came with a very strong agenda to say on 15-minute neighborhoods how walking, cycling can be promoted. You have cities like Vienna, on the other hand, which for many years have been doing many policies and many projects to sort of mainstream gender in the projects that they do. So in your opinion, how important is it for cities to have strong visions for it being gender equal itself, so that in the long run there is resilience going forward, no matter if it's a man or a woman who is stepping in for leading it for a period of time, that vision is able to drive the city forward?
I think it's extremely important. That's why the three kind of layers at which change happens that I put out was, the first one was who has power, because power comes from lots of places. Power comes from having a political seat, having a political platform. Power also comes from having a lot of money. So are there women who are in leading positions like the mayor of Paris? And then are there women on the other hand, on the money end? We all know philanthropies and foundations control a lot of like giving to nonprofits who are trying to do this kind of work, whether that's ITDP or Project for Public Spaces. Are there women who are presidents and on the boards of these large philanthropic foundations? Are there women controlling these mega billion-dollar endowments that are being utilized to create better cities of tomorrow? So women's representation in positions of power and in all the ways that power comes from is extremely important. And then once that position is given, bold commitments is probably the only way forward. You know, we're living through a global pandemic right now, and we are all seeing the kinds of data that's coming out of which cities did the best job almost like handling the pandemic. It's not something you can stop because it's a virus, but which cities did the most kind of humane and the first, human-centered, well-being first kind of approach. And then we see that all those cities that did so much better are all led by women. And there is something there. So this is the time for bold leadership, and this is the time to make bold commitments, because what we are trying to undo has been going on for centuries. So if we move at the pace at which we got here, we will need centuries and centuries to undo it. And in the age of climate change and pandemics and coronavirus, we may not have centuries unless we act fast and unless we act now. So I want to speak a little bit more to Paris's commitment to scaling back cars and really investing in public transportation and walking. That is all based in data. Like, none of this was something that the mayor had to come up with on her own. Vinita touched on it briefly before, but when we think about cars, this researcher in the UK, Carolyn Correda-Perez, wrote a book called Invisible Women. And she talks about how in the design of cars and their safety systems and their safety infrastructure, the body that is utilized to create all the systems of a car is a 50th percentile male body, a tall white man. When Ford is designing, when Chevy is designing, when other cars are being designed, that's the dummy that they're using to design. Where does the steering go? Where do the brakes go? How does the safety infrastructure pull in, and airbags and all these other things? So our cars are designed for men. And then we let people tell us and fall into these stereotypes of, oh, women die more in car crashes because women are shitty drivers. I was like, hold on a second. The car is not designed to protect a woman. Our shoulder structure is different. Our pelvic structure is different. Our chest is different. Our proportions of torso to legs is different. How do you expect us to operate a machine, which is a killing machine for the one inside and outside, that is not even designed with our comfort, well-being, and safety in mind? So that to me was just mind-blowing, that because again, in the US, 50% of the drivers on the roads are probably women, and they're all putting themselves at risk every time they get behind the wheel. So what the mayor of Paris is saying is actually fully baked in data and evidence that cars are not made for women. And then when you think about how do women even want to travel through their cities, ITDP has a lot of data about women usually don't do point A to point B trips. It's not a simple, oh, I go from home to work and work back home. Women like to do something that's called trip chaining. We like to stop and do multiple things along the way. And then when you want to do that, chances are you're not going or voluntarily wanting to go an hour and a half to go to work. You want to make multiple but shorter journeys. So that aligns with the mayor's idea of in 15 minutes, we got to do as many things as possible, because again, 50% of Paris's population needs their needs met as well. And then women don't want to be too far from their home and their families when they're going to work. So again, if it were to us, the diameter of our life would be much smaller than the diameter of life for a man who's also in part of the workforce. So I think everything that the mayor is trying to advance is baked in data. We know these things. Our gut tells us these things are right, but there's also data that supports it. So when we've had data for centuries, like, let's get on it.
Yeah. Very, very valid points. And the funny thing in most Indian cities and some of the ones that we have worked with, like you rightly said, the representation itself is not there. And hence, yeah, there are many gaps that are in the air. At the same time, the conversation on women's safety and mobility, etc., has gained a lot of momentum in recent years, and cities want to do something about it, but certainly they're not approaching it in the ways that you mentioned, that you need to look at it holistically and not just look at one project and one funding, but you need to cover all the aspects. But at the same time, for instance, there is a Nirbhaya project funding that's given by the central government in India right now for all the states and cities. And in a recent survey that was done, it showed how this funding was sitting idle, dormant for quite a period of time in most of the cities across India, because the cities did not know how to put this to good use. The lack of enough capacity in the city was a very striking thing, as in how do decision makers go about taking the right path? Are there enough standards and guidelines that are there? You mentioned about it in your presentation that most of these standards that are there right now are prepared at a time, and it was very male-centric as well. So what are your thoughts on that? How can this gap of capacity in the decision-making platforms be addressed in a situation where having representation of women itself is quite a long way to go?
Right. I think the representation in one place actually does already exist, which is, as I talked about, the layers, the political layer, the interpreters and planners and professionals, and then the day-to-day users, people who are in space in our cities. The day-to-day user layer is already there, because, there are lots of women who ride public transportation. And I know that if we were just talking about percentages, a higher percentage of women who are in the workforce take public transportation as opposed to men. So there is already representation in women riders. Chances are that, again, if I can completely draw on my own experience, chances are that they are traveling on public transportation somewhat uncomfortable. So think about having an itch for an extended period of time that you just can't do anything about. And you're very uncomfortable, and then it just doesn't go away. Now think about living with that itch for your entire life. Are you performing at your 100%? No. Do you want to get out of that situation, stop riding public transportation? Absolutely. But if somebody gave me an opportunity to actually ask me, where is the itch and how can it be cured? I probably have an idea. So if women are uncomfortable in any way on public transportation, and we actually ask them, and if it's simple things like, I would like if the window did not open so that nobody could reach their hand through the window of the bus, can probably be done. What if I said, and this is my personal preference, I don't like seats in public transportation that face forward, because if everybody's facing forward, there's somebody behind me. And that really scares me that, somebody could reach for my bag, somebody could try to grope me. These are not hypotheticals. They have happened to me riding buses in India. So if I had the choice, I would rather have seats that actually face the center, where my back is towards the window, a window that doesn't open. And then I know that my back is protected. I have refuge. And then I have prospect, because I can see everybody in front of me and I can see the activity in the bus. Immediately, my level of comfort changes dramatically. And these things this is not a system that needs to change. This is the design of the bus we're talking about. So some of these things are easier to do, and they start to, again, show women who are riding public transportation, who are participating in day-to-day life, that their experience and their voice actually matters. Then they might be more willing to think about themselves in positions of power as designing these bus systems and thinking more critically about it, because suddenly their voice and their experience matters. So power structures take a while to shift, but representation on the ground is already there. They're just not being consulted.
Speaking on the importance of design, over the years of your experience, any projects in particular that resonate very strongly with you that you have seen or been part of, where a good design has been able to bring a lot of change and experience of space itself that you can think of?
I think in recent years, we've been hearing a lot about that. The first time I went to UN Women Conference, it was in Delhi, and I heard about all these great initiatives like Safety Pen, and I heard about ITDP India, and then I started looking at the manuals that you guys have created about better cities for women and for kids, and that was incredibly important to me, because then I started thinking about that in every project that I do. I've stopped discounting my own voice, so I think I would almost bring that back to it. It depends on the practitioner. So every project that I've done has been impacted by my exposure to work that others have been done, and I've let that influence me. The work of the inspiration of Paris's mayor, it's amazing, because again, here's a woman in position of leadership who's talking about how do we need to change things and change them systematically. Jeanette Sadiq Khan in New York was another one of those really important people who really took the power and grew into that power and utilized it to do good in the city. And we now also, again, our Department of Transportation is led by another woman, Polly Trottenberg. That's important to see as well, because there's representation. And then Barcelona is coming up with some really great initiatives that are, again, talking about these super blocks, which is exactly the idea of how do you live your full life within a distance close to where your family is, where your belongings are, where your home is, because why should you have to leave? It should never be compulsory that you have to leave your neighborhood to earn a living. It should be optional. And then the power and the decision is back on us. And I know that Mexico City has initiatives around women's safety on public transportation, and they've been implementing a lot of things on their buses to make women feel more safe. I'm forgetting, I think it was Berlin, public transportation free for women. But I would point people to the World Bank's repository, UN Women, ITDP, global nonprofits that are actually kind of keeping track of everything that's going on. But there's lots of inspiration to go around. Venu, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you for that. I was just typing to inform everyone else on the call that in case you have any question that's brewing in your mind, please type it in the chat box. And if we have time, which Vinita will let us know, we can probably pick a couple of questions that you all have to raise as well. Yeah. So with that,
Zoom has gifted us more time in the course of this conversation. So we're not limited to 45 minutes. I guess it would go on a little longer if you wanted to, and it shouldn't have questions. So carry on.
Probably a couple of more questions from my side, and if any of you have a question from your side, you can either type it in the chat box, or we can take it right after as well. So Vinita, the conversation on public transportation again. So it's like you mentioned, some of the studies that we had done with Safety Pen in India had shown how women normally give up opportunities for jobs if the job opportunity is farther away for them from home, and they end up either not taking the job at all, or taking up a job which is less of an opportunity for them to grow at a closer place, because they don't have a means to commute safely from point A to point B, either because of unsafe transport, either because it's unreliable, or it's expensive for them. What is your take on the importance for cities to invest in making public transportation systems, in particular the IPG systems, etc., in Indian cities safer, so that even women users can, depend on these modes and they can access the many opportunities that they have around?
Right. I think it's very, very important. And data, again, will support us here too. So when we look at cities, again, let's just talk about New York City. This city is not perfect, but this is where I live. So I have things too that I can relate to. It has an expansive subway system. More than 50% of the population is women, but women also tend to live closer to public transportation. You'll often see that there are lots of these slightly fancier apartment complexes that are farther from the subway, that are next to the rivers. We have two beautiful rivers, and there are these beautiful apartment complexes that look onto the river. they tend to have more male population, and women live closer to the subway stations. And we make those choices with our money. You know, again, we kind of vote with our dollar or with our rupee. We choose where to spend our money. And if we choose to live near subways, that shows the preference right there that there's a system that runs 24 hours. Many women in New York City, a city like this, you know, are part of the workforce. And we like easy access to our subway stations. But then even still, when you do that, there's again that need to connect systems, because the chances of you living next to a train that would take you directly to work are also relatively low. So then how does your train connect to the other train that you need to take? The connection that you need to make to go to your work is also really important. Is that connection reliable? Is that connection safe? And are you going to be penalized for making that connection? Can you make it on the same ticket, or will you have to swipe your card again and pay again? So how do we make that a seamless experience of connecting is again very important. This becomes a little bit more of a problem when you're connecting between modes. If you're connecting between a bus and a train again, it sometimes becomes tricky. More and more cities are trying to make that more seamless, like trying to connect your card to the person. So if you've tapped it in the past hour, you don't have to tap it again. But these are still budding systems, and not like New York doesn't have a seamless system where you can go from one mode to another without having to worry about paying again. So that's another thing to think about. How does that connection get made? And then once you do get dropped off at either end of your journey, the last 1 block or 2 block, 2-minute walk or 5-minute walk can also be a make or break for women on either end. So if I think about, you know, the times that I took a bus from where I was living in Delhi to somewhere where my sister was living in Gurgaon, my experience on both ends was very different on what my walk looked like getting just from home to the bus stop. Whether that is safe, whether there are things to do, eyes on the street, other women, and not just women users, but women in position of power. Are there women vendors and women entrepreneurs, women-owned businesses as part of that 5-minute journey? Because all it takes is this one bad experience, a 1 minute in a 1-hour journey that can really make or break your confidence in wanting to make that journey every day. So we have to think about the entire journey. We have to think about it holistically. And then why do we even have to travel an hour? That's another question that comes up a lot. Like, why do we still need these clusters of urban development that are the financial hubs of a city, and then residential is separate? That separation is starting to be questioned a lot as well. You know, we need mix of land uses so we can live closer to where we work, because why should we all have to travel if at the end of the day it's all in the same city and our taxes are going back to the same city? Why does it have to be separated? Has come under question a lot too. And understanding what that workforce is and what kinds of jobs they hold, we have to start to quantify the benefit of women participating more fully in the workforce. And is that financial incentive big enough, which I would argue is, to actually start to move the jobs and move their locations closer to where women want to be?
On that note, I'd like to urge all the other participants, when you get time, to probably listen the Urbanistica podcast in particular, and the other 2 links that Vinita had shared of conversations with Nidhi, where she elaborates a lot more on this conversation about participation of women in the workforce and how investing in better transportation systems can bring about this change. So that's a great listen, and it's a podcast as well. So like Vinita touched upon initially, the placemaking community in India, like in other countries as well, has a lot of faces from different backgrounds. You have many champions from different sectors. And of late, in many Indian cities, what we have been noticing as well is that you have someone like a bicycle mayor, you have NGOs, you have resident welfare associations who are stepping up and taking on the baton because they don't see a particular city doing its job well enough. Or probably the city is doing some good steps and they step in as well so that they can support the city in going forward much better. So this has brought about quite a lot of change as well. Cities like Bangalore have seen new cycle tracks that are being discussed right now, and a lot of change in the conversations. Are there any projects that comes to your mind on these on-ground tools that the local communities can look at if they want to bring about change, or anything that you have been part of either?
I would direct everybody to look at nonprofits in the United States. This is the one place where I would actually say, look at urbanism nonprofits in the US, because there is the impact community, the impact sector, which is what nonprofits sit under, is pretty old, pretty active, and pretty well researched and written about in the US. It's always been the center entity that has held our public officials, our public entities, and our private forces, the business community, kind of in line. This has been the center that has been in charge of accountability on both ends. And also, when we think about solving large-scale social problems, when we think about social innovation, it really needs to occur at the intersection of all three of these sectors. You know, the impact sector has to know what they're fighting for. What is the social problem? The public forces have to acknowledge that movement and start to change policies and start to change the systems that underpin our cities. And then the private sector has to really develop a market force and a market system around that social problem. So those three sectors need to really come together for us to effectively solve social problems. So I'm encouraged to hear that the impact sector is growing in India, but look at some of the more sort of hardened social impact organizations here and see, you know, for example, the work of Project for Public Spaces. We're a nonprofit. So for 45 years, what we've been doing is trying to promote better city planning and design without being public officials ourselves, and making our services available, and at the same time writing about what we've seen or happen around the world, and creating these tools and best practices and kits, which is exactly what ITDP does, another nonprofit. Again, the idea is to capture knowledge and share knowledge, and by doing that, trying to hold both our public and business sectors accountable in aligning around that social problem. So I would say, yes, look at ITDP's publications. You know, free shout out to you guys too. Project for Public Spaces is resources. I would also say, we talked briefly about Bernard Van Leer Foundation. They have a lot of resources on their website as well, because they're funding a lot of initiatives around early childhood development. And as we can all imagine, the unpaid labor almost of like child caring oftentimes rests with female identifiers in a family. So women and women identifying people tend to carry more of the, I don't want to call it load, because I think people who do that enjoy it, but do play a bigger role in child caring. So because Bernard Van Leer Foundation is looking a lot at early childhood development, by doing that, in extension, they're also thinking about young caregivers and mothers and what their well-being looks like. So that gives us a construct in which multiple populations that are equally vulnerable are tied, and how we can advance both their well-being at the same time, and our advocacy efforts would go further. So I would say their publications are incredibly important too. And what else? UN Women, I already said. The World Bank's handbook that we saw a video for is fascinating. It's really great because it lays out methods to actually consult with women and validate the things that we hear from women, again, back into the recommendations that we make.
Sure. So I think we have had a great discussion and we are right at the edge of an hour, but let's take a question that Anandi has raised. Anandi, if you're on the line, would you like to voice the question as well?
Yeah, Anadi Saxena, you had a question.
Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, ma'am, as you were discussing about developing design, especially for women, so I wanted to ask you, like, would it be a right way to go if we developed neighborhood level mobility, micro mobility plans, which like on the basis of a participatory planning approach, and especially trying to accommodate the views of women who actually live there and face general issues in their day-to-day life? What if we make micro mobility plans based on their opinion, and also while using placemaking as a tool? Would that be a right way to go?
Absolutely. That's the middle layer. You know, the entire transportation system, neighborhood level, bus stop level. You're talking about the middle layer, the neighborhood level. That would be an incredibly important place to begin. I would actually plug in a resource. We launched an initiative called Portals to Places, like a portal, like a space portal.
So I read it today. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so we launched that last year, and the entire idea behind Portals to Places was, how do we think about our bus stops and train stations as destinations in their own right. And by destination, I don't mean Grand Central. By destination, I mean a cluster of daily needs and activities that we need to do anyway in our daily lives, and cluster that around our bus stop and train station so that women don't have to make multiple trips, so that we don't have to like spend 3 hours in a day going to the grocery store, going to laundry, childcare, school, all the other places. How do we bring all of that together to actually create a life around that bus stop and train station? So if women had to use that bus stop to go to work or whatever, there's that only one journey they have to make, and then they can grab the other things they need on their way back. So this is like kind of a cluster of that trip chaining idea I was talking about. So everything you need to chain, what about that chain if it existed around your bus stop? But it's important to consult with women, because how would we know what does that daily destination cluster look like? What are the things that women need? What are the things that keep women from participating in the economy or from safely being able to do all the things they need to do on a daily basis? So to come up with that list of what they need, you absolutely need the users. You need to talk to women about what is it that you need to do on a daily basis, and how can we bring those things a little bit closer to you, a little bit more safely, so you can, you know, thrive again. So your well-being can be put first and foremost in your neighborhood.
Thank you.
Vinita, do we have time for one more question from an attendee?
Yes, by all means, go ahead. Yeah, because we've not sure how much time they've been gifting us, but
once they extend, I think we have quite a bit of time, but then again, yeah, we can wrap it up in a question or two. Harshita, that's a very interesting question on behavioral change and how the mindset is important. Would you like to elaborate more and raise the question from your side?
Hi ma'am, this is Harshita. I'm from Bangalore, and I work for a very small non-profit that is in its very budding stages. And we've also tried to engage with communities and, you know, do civic engagements and all of that. While doing that, like, we have noticed that women themselves do not come forward. Like, it's always men, you know, coming and talking to us and communicating to us, and we interacting mostly with men. But if we were to drive that entire aspect of bringing them forward and showcasing that they need to voice out, like, and, you know, the whole idea of women are important in the city planning, and their feedback is very important, their participation is important. How do we bring about that whole communication? Like, I found a small challenge in even, you know, driving that communication.
Mm-hmm. So first thing I want to point out is the idea of having a public meeting and a conversation when people need to speak up is a very patriarchal idea. Who decided that you need to voice your opinion for your opinion to matter? So what we're expecting women to do by thinking that how do we make them voice their opinion is expecting them to act like men. Because if they're not doing that, maybe that's not the way they want to communicate. So we have to take several steps back and think about, how do women like to communicate? Not the method that we are giving to them. How do women like to communicate? Do women like to write? Do women like to have one-on-one conversation around a cup of tea? Do women want us to knock at their door and try to fill out a survey? I don't know. I'm not saying which one of these is true, but we need to first and foremost ask women, how would you like to be engaged? How would you like to share your challenges and your pains and your problems with your city? Because this is the most intimate kind of conversation. What pains you? What bothers you in your city? And we have to create a platform first and foremost, which matches their level of comfort. You see that here in the US too. You know, when you go to a public meeting where somebody makes a presentation and you invite questions, you'll usually see people who are the most comfortable speaking up in these settings getting up and speaking up, and people who are not comfortable will not say anything. Sometimes people would write on pieces of paper that are anonymous feedback, and you'll get more feedback. And so you have to really understand, how do they want to be engaged? So not how you want to be engaged, not what the system allows, how they want you to talk to them, and what method of communication do they prefer? Or do they want to communicate on Instagram or Facebook? I don't know, but it's something that needs to be asked. And then you need to create a community engagement system that reflects directly the desires of the group that you're trying to engage. So that's number one. The other thing I want to talk about is behavior change takes time. And there's a lot of social stigma around buses, and there's a lot of social eliteness around automobiles. So changing those kinds of behaviors would take a long time, and it's going to be a long battle. We have to think at all three levels of the system to start to make other options available, and then people have to use them to slowly embrace them. But even on a daily basis, when we talk about things, we have to talk much more in a behavior, like people behavior language. And I'll give you an example. Oftentimes when you go talk about a street and you talk about redesigning the street to better accommodate cars and cycles and all that, we usually go and say, this is where the drivers go. This is where the cyclists go. This is where the pedestrians go. This is where the bus riders go. You would notice that each one of them is an identity. You've put the mode before the human. You've called somebody a cyclist, and now their identity is tied to their cycle. What it is, though, in reality, is a behavior that somebody's doing in one time. So you have to talk about more like people driving, people cycling, people walking, because that one person is capable of doing multiple things. And then you've suddenly decoupled the behavior from the human, and you've demonstrated that behavior can change. Human is human. The same person can cycle, walk, drive, and do all of those things, and their identity doesn't rely on being called a cyclist. And then they don't get trapped in that image of, what does a cyclist look like? Is it somebody who's on a road bike, looks really athletic? No, it's a human cycling, and then you can put any human in that picture, and then it's a behavior they're doing. So you have to really utilize a human language, a people first language, and start to desegregate the behavior from the human, and not kind of like, it's not my identity. I like to walk everywhere. I've embraced the identity of a pedestrian, but I would really like to be just called a human who likes to use other modes except a car.
I think that was a very beautiful message to wrap up the conversation as well. The importance of understanding the users itself, the way that they would love to communicate. And in fact, my partner Shruti has been sitting here and listening to the whole conversation, and she's been grimming all along, saying that, she's seeing the right thing and giving a thumbs up. So it's been a great 1 hour of discussion that we have had. And before I hand it over to Vinita again, Nidhi, any closing thoughts from your side? Has the pandemic sort of reopened this box of things that were not answered? Has it increased the divide a lot more? What are your thoughts and closing remarks on this?
The pandemic has put a lot of things in perspective. I think it's a very, very humbling moment. And not just the pandemic, the fact that we are in the middle of racial uprising, which looks very much like the racial uprisings of the past in the US, around the world, because people are more aware than ever before, I would say, of the things that have been utilized, the mechanisms have been utilized to keep certain people oppressed, to keep certain populations oppressed. Women have been oppressed since, I don't know, data keeping began. And if this is a moment to capture. This is a moment to be very, very angry, and not just to be angry. There are tools out there at our disposal to actually utilize them. So I have said this several times, maybe even on the Urbanistica podcast, that what COVID-19 is doing to the world right now, the people who are dying at a higher rate, the people who are disadvantaged at a higher rate, the people who don't have a choice to shelter in place and work from home, we already knew who those people were. The data always existed. What is happening in the world right now is a social justice advocate's biggest nightmare playing out in front of their eyes. And this is something that they'd been warning since social justice advocates become social justice advocates. So this moment is a moment that we should not come back out of into a normal, because the normal that we left behind was too deficient. It was just simply not good enough. So we have to come out of this pandemic, the racial uprising, into a different reality that actually acknowledges the gaps of the past, that acknowledges all the ways in which women identifying people have been oppressed, in which queer people have been oppressed, in which other gender identities have been intentionally and systematically kept out of the loop, out of the room, off the table. We cannot go back to the normal that we left behind.
With that note, I think that let's all be optimistic that the pandemic, like Nidhi rightly pointed out, it's realigned the way that we should look at decision making and our perspectives. And let's hope that all Indian cities will also start relooking at how the cities were being planned and designed to the very finer details. And let's be optimistic in the years ahead. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. And Vinita, it's back to you for the closing remarks.
Actually, there was your very last remark ties in with Divya's question in the chat about the binary understanding of gender, men and women. She was asking, how do we make a shift in our urban discourse, in our practice with respect to this? The third gender.
Sure, Nidhi, would you like to take that? I just missed the question. Thanks for bringing it out, Vinita.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I would like to take that question. I personally feel, and this is my choice alone, I'm a self-identifying feminist. I think that female identifying people have been oppressed for so long that we are now trying to fight for equality. We're trying to fight for actually equity, to close that gap that we've created over centuries. And when we do that, we should bring different gender identities along, because we already know what it feels like to be oppressed. It is our job to be more inclusive in our language. And I've been trying, as if you've been noticing, I've been trying over and over to say female identifying people, other gender identities, because we know what it's like, and it's our job to bring them with. And most people usually do talk in binaries because data keeping is biased. Our census has been kept in a binary. We haven't been allowed to find what we identify as. So the data exists in a binary, but we have to, in our conversation, just like I said, humanize transportation and humanize transportation narrative. We have to start to humanize advocacy and activism when it comes to gender identity. So I would take that it's my job to say that more and more, and to understand what it's like to be not looked at and not acknowledged in the creation of a built environment. And that should absolutely be the case, because it's 2020. We're in the 21st century. We cannot live in the binary world that was created for us centuries ago.
Thank you, Nidhi. I think your responses, even over the last few questions, were bringing that out. So that made me think about this question more pertinently, and to kind of, think about strategies in which the other identities can also be made more inclusive in our conversation. Thank you for this.
Absolutely. Words are very, very powerful, and it takes somebody to say one wrong sentence and one wrong word to discredit somebody else and to discredit somebody else's existence. So the first thing to change is the narrative and how we acknowledge the existence of other gender identities.
Thank you so much, Nidhi, and also Venu for making this a really interesting session. We'll be posting the recording on our YouTube channel, Placemaking India's YouTube channel, next week. So do look out for that, and we'll also be promoting that on LinkedIn. The next speaker is Ankita Chachra, and this will probably happen in a couple of weeks' time. She's Senior Program Manager at the Global Designing Cities Initiative at the National Association of City Transportation Officials. She also lives in New York. So this will be a great follow-on to Nidhi. And Nidhi, I'm hoping you'll continue to support us as you have, and mentoring Placemaking India. I'm
easy to find on PPS's website. You're welcome to email me. I'm always happy to help.
Nidhi, do you want to put your email on the chat box?
I'm on it. There we go.
Great, thank you. This has been a real eye-opener, and especially what you said about communicating with women and finding distinct ways to what they feel comfortable with. That's among some of the revelations that I personally really benefited from, and wish you all the best for your future, your pledge, your mission, which I really admire you for. So thank you.
Thank you, Vinita. I'm glad you pointed that out about asking that one particular thing that I said. it's actually a part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion discourse underway right now, where people are saying, where it's not so much about treat the other like you would like to be treated. No, no, no. Why would I treat somebody else like I want to be treated? We should treat the other the way they want to be treated. And that immediately changes everything. Then the behavior, my behavior is governed by how somebody else wants to be treated, what their preferences, what their life is like. And that makes me much more mindful of trying to understand what it is that they need. So that is what truly creates inclusion, is to try to treat other people as they want to be treated and not enforce your own biases on them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Venu, did you have anything to say, or your?
I think on that note, it's a very positive note, and we can wrap up on that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and stay tuned for the next session.
Bye.